Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. I've quoted Wendell Berry here before saying, isn't it interesting how you read just the right book at just the right time, you meet the right person at just the right time, you have the right conversation at just the right time. And one of those times for me, I remember getting lost in the streets of Washington, D.C. with my guest today, where we were supposed to be with a larger group, and we did not think to remember where we were supposed to be going. And in that walk, I had a conversation about a variety of topics that I have thought about ever since. And I do every time I read or hear from Richard Mouw. He was president of Fuller Seminary for 20 years and is distinguished professor of faith and public life there. Received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago, has written 19 books, and we're going to be talking about a couple of them today, including an updated version of his book, Uncommon Decency, Christian Civility in an Uncivil World. A lot to talk about with that. And Divine Generosity, the Scope of Salvation in Reformed Theology. And there's going to be some of you, because I know we have a lot of people who are not Christians who listen to this show who are going to say, well, I mean, that's the part that won't really apply to me, not just theology, but a specific kind of No. I can tell you the conversation we're going to have today is about a lot of the things that you're questioning and asking right now about what's going on in your own life and about what's going on in the world. And maybe this will stimulate you to think about it in a different way. Richard Mouw, thanks for being here today.
Hey, great. And once again, we're going to be talking together where we're not quite sure where we're going.
So. That's right. Yes, that's right. That's right. Maybe somebody will come get us when it's time to be done. I'm wondering, you've written on civility, not just in this updated book, but you've written about it for a long time. I was just talking to a woman not long ago who's in a conflict in her church. And this is someone who's posting a lot of really nasty, uncivil things about her on social media, on her social media pages, and so forth. And this woman is trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I respond to that? And she talked to someone who has expertise in sort of conflict management and so forth. And this person said, really, the only thing that you can do is to ridicule this person, because that's the only thing that will actually shut this down, is to respond with ridicule. And the woman said, I'm not going to do that for obvious sorts of reasons, but am I being put at a disadvantage here? So you know what to do. How would you help her to start thinking about how to respond to that situation?
Yeah, that's a great case to think about, because obviously ridicule hurts, and we want to either have the pain go away, or we want to inflict pain on the people that's causing it for us. But it's not from a Christian point of view. It's not right. We've got to be willing to accept pain when it's not clear how to get rid of it. But at the same time, there may be some things we can do. And I would want, Russell, you and I would agree on this, that she has to be able to see that other person differently than she would see them if she thought the only thing we could do is to ridicule that person. And to see that person as more than a ridiculer. I'm convinced that people who say harsh things or have views that I find very nasty or very difficult to accept are often struggling with some things that are hidden from me.
Mm-hmm.
Just being able to acknowledge that.
Mm.
And maybe she can say to that person, I feel like you're ridiculing me a lot. What's going on with you?
Mm.
Are there things that you and I can talk about that can help to clarify things? If she could manage to say something kind about that person, that would be really, really a good thing. But it's really the whole business of, to put it in non-biblical terms, learning civility and trying to be civil toward a person, because civility is a kind of honoring of a person's humanity. And we need to be able to get at that humanity, I think, and civility is a way to do that.
Somebody was telling this woman, said, well, Jesus was often using what many people would consider to be contemptuous, sort of almost ridiculing language. And so we can't be more civil than Jesus.
Yeah.
And that was one thing that was she genuinely had to grapple with that and to ask, is that the case? How would you help her with that part of it?
Well, that's really a very important point, because Jesus typically, when he did use uncivil language, it was toward religious leaders or other kind of powerful people whom he thought was leading other people astray and weren't really open to learning more about him and wanting to honor him. So, I wrote this book on civility, and at a certain point, while I was writing it, somebody said to me, when I said I was working on civility, well, would you be civil to Adolf Hitler? Yeah. And I said, no, I'm not a pacifist, so I'd probably be willing even to use physical force to stop him from the horrible things that he was doing. Civility is not the whole story in life, but we often take incivility much too far. And so it's better to find ways of being civil. But no, there are certain things. And so, I hate Hitler's ideas. I hate his actions. And I would have a very hard time being civil toward him. But, then after I wrote my book, a couple came to me, and their teenage son had gotten into skinhead, neo-Nazi kind of that kind of crowd. And they asked whether I would talk to him. And here was a guy who accepted Hitler's ideas. But when I sat down to him, I wasn't wanting to shoot him or wrestle him to the ground. I wanted to talk to him about what is it about these ideas that you find so attractive? And he wanted to talk about a pure race, not having a lot of polluting influences around him in the human community. And we had a good conversation about that, because, the Apostle Peter says to the early church, you're a chosen race. But we're not a chosen race in a sense that he was just talking to white people or brown people. He was talking to aliens and exiles from a lot of different provinces, a lot of different backgrounds, and saying that it's in him that we find the kind of unity and the kind of holy race and a sense of being chosen. And Hitler can't come up with answers to those kinds of yearnings. And so I would, I think in the case of that woman too, that we would want to say to her, she would want to say to the person, if she could engage the person in a conversation, what is it about me that you find so offensive? Really, what is it about me? I'm eager to hear about that, just to show that she's willing to take a look at herself and through the eyes of this woman, and where necessary, she should apologize. And maybe she could answer by telling some of the stories about her own life and asking whether there are things like that have happened in this other person's life. Change the tone of the conversation.
There are a lot of congregations right now, and this has been the case for several years, that are really, really divided. I heard a person tell me one time that her family was really bitterly divided over some political questions, weren't speaking to each other. But when they were at their mother's deathbed, The mother had a terminal disease and was dying, and they all stood around the bed and held hands and prayed the Lord's Prayer. When they got to that part, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive, there was this sense where everybody kind of paused for a second. And she said it was actually that pause in the prayer that was the moment of grace, because they all kind of realized, wait, do we really believe this or not? And I find that really moving. I think about it all the time.
That's a very moving story. I love that. And those moments of grace and the whole need for grace. You know, one of the big questions that pastors pose to me in confidence is, how do I handle patriotic stuff in church? You know, Memorial Day is coming up. 4th of July is coming up. And I'm going to have to go through all of this stuff again, you know?
Yeah.
And I want to say, actually, in a lot of that patriotic stuff, there are teaching opportunities. You know, we sing, God shed his grace on thee. You know? Does America need grace? In our public life, do we need grace? Once we've prayed that prayer to God, how can we act as if our own nation is faultless, or a certain view about our patriotism is a faultless thing? God, mend our every flaw. You know, when we come as citizens and we sing a song like that, that's it. We might as well be going to church when we sing that, because we're asking God to mend the flaws, to forgive us our trespasses, even as we forgive those who trespass against us.
You mentioned talking to this young man about becoming involved with this kind of Hitlerism, neo-Nazi sort of talk. And it's interesting. I'm seeing a lot of that out there, and it's almost always young men
Yes.
who are becoming involved in that. Why do you think that is? And how should we what need is not being met to the point that it can be twisted into something this evil?
Oh boy, I really haven't thought all of that through. Obviously, we're hearing a lot these days. In fact, I was just reading the Washington Post this morning about that young men are attracted to a certain candidate that women aren't so attracted to, you know. And it has to do with tough talk, with embodying a certain image of manliness. I really think in my lifetime we've had wonderful new sensitivities that have developed for all of us about gender questions, you know, about the kind of leadership that women can provide, but the gifts of women that have often been brutally denied, the ways in which they've often been horribly abused by male authority or males in authority over them, all of that. But at the same time, I know that those kinds of sensitivities can lead to men thinking, "What about me?" You know, and there's a sense of loss. I think when there was, I think even in the Hitler Germany situation, there was a sense that things were being taken away from people, and that Hitler was promising to restore them. And let me tell you a story. I was interviewed by I got a phone call from a reporter for The Economist last year. And he said, hey, I don't know much about religion, but I got to write this story on Mormons in public life. And somebody told me you'd be a good person to talk to about that. And he said, I've got a really blunt question for you. He said, why are Mormons so much better in the public square than evangelicals? They're much nicer, you know? And we had a wonderful conversation about that, you know, because we evangelicals, Bible-believing Christians, in the 19th century, we still felt like we owned the culture. You know? This was our nation, under God. We could sing songs like, you know, Patriot's Dream, It Sees Beyond the Years, you know, all of this wonderful stuff. America's a Christian nation, and we're the Christians who are called to take responsibility for that. But then some difficult things came up. Evolutionism, various kinds of secularism emerged. So that George Marsden, the historian, said that for evangelicals, going from the 19th to the 20th century was like an immigration experience. They were moving into a new land that they didn't recognize anymore. And there was this sense that emerged in the 20th century. They have taken away my nation, and I do not know where they've buried it. You know, this tremendous sense of loss. We used to own the culture. Now we don't. We're made fun of. We're ridiculed. You know, the monkey trials and all of this kind of thing. Whereas Mormonism in the 19th century was a marginalized group. Mm-hmm. They came up with a lot of hostility toward them. And through the 20th century, they began to accommodate more to the general patterns of American culture, including with dealing with the issues of plural marriages and race and the like. So in the 21st century, they arrived. I mean, Mitt Romney became a candidate for the presidency of the United States with a major political party. There was a sense that, hey, we're finally accepted. And so for Mormonism, there's a kind of satisfaction that finally they've been given a voice, that finally they're acceptable at the table. Whereas for evangelicals, it still is, we used to own that table. And now we're not even allowed to sit there without being made fun of or being told that you're not welcome, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a tremendous sense of grief and loss that often goes into anger against certain kinds of patterns in life. And even though I have learned so much and am so sympathetic to women who have felt that finally they have an opportunity to be heard, to be taken seriously. They can talk about their abuse. They can talk about their being rejected in various ways. I have so much sympathy for that, and I'm so grateful to God for it. But at the same time, their boyfriends and their husbands often feel like they've lost something, you know? And we need to be able to deal with that, honestly, and talk about that. And not just shout at each other.
Lost something in terms of not knowing really what it means to be a man now?
I think that's a part of it, yes. And we still have the superheroes in our popular culture that, you know, you and I were raised in a world where Superman really was a Superman, you know. Mm-hmm. These days, Superman has to be willing to show tears once in a while, you know. He has to apologize once in a while. He would never do that when I was a kid, you know. Batman and Spider-Man are much more humane, much more feeling-oriented in the depictions today than they were when you and I were growing up. Those are wonderful lessons to learn if we have learned them properly, but they can easily give rise to bitterness, a sense of grief, and a sense of loss. And sometimes the anger, Hitlerian kind of anger, is a form of grieving.
You know, you're a Calvinist.
Yes.
And one of the things that happened in American life over the last 25 years or so was the young, restless, reformed sort of movement. There was a time when there would be massive, huge conferences for what were called at the time the new Calvinists in the culture, coming out of all of various different sorts of evangelical streams, churches, denominations, church planting movements that maybe had not seen that kind of theological orientation in a while, or at least not explicitly expressed. That seems to be changing now in some ways. What do you think Calvinism is going to have to bring to the rest of the church in this era that we're facing now?
It's one of my favorite questions, and I don't know all the real answers to them. But, you know, at the heart of Calvinism is a depiction of the human person in relationship to God, where the human person is at best finite and weak, and at worst a sinner who has really offended the proper standards of humanity that God has set forth. And that God is a God who both dislikes, we say even hates, the horrors of our sinful condition, but is also a God who is gracious and willing to forgive and willing to bring people even and to do for us through Christ what we are incapable of doing for ourselves, you know. And so in many ways, Calvinism ought to be a religion of humility, of self-critique, and of honoring God who is willing to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And that's it. But at the same time, it can come across as an arrogant theology. You know, I've been chosen and you haven't. You know, and we can even take. You know, there was a rebel Calvinist novelist, Peter de Vries, who was talking about his upbringing, and he said, you know, very often the sense of humility in Calvinism was really a form of pride. That I know about sin more than you know about sin. And I'm special because God has chosen me. And I think that's the pattern that we need to get beyond. You know, I find this so much in good Calvinist writing and in the scriptures that are important to Calvinists, and that is that God is God and we aren't, and that we need to conform to God's gracious purposes for what it means for human beings to flourish. And that doesn't mean being prideful and abusive. It means acknowledging that when I even think about Hitler, as much as I hate what he stood for and what he did, there's a sense in which sometimes I can see a little bit of that in myself, you know. Not the anti-Semitism or not the desire to kill people or herd them in the gas chambers, but I can see something of the kind of prideful sense that I'm right and others are wrong, and that I can come up with answers to difficult questions. And I just need to acknowledge, I mean, that old line there, but for the grace of God go I. But there's a sense of, we also need to be in solidarity with people who are openly rebellious against God.
I was just reading a book by your fellow Calvinist philosopher, Nicholas Wolterstorff, on grief. And he was talking about sovereignty of God, and he was quoting Calvin on the meticulous sovereignty of God, and said that he found it repugnant, and he didn't find it repugnant as someone standing outside of Scripture, he thought, but he found it repugnant on the basis of being someone who was shaped by Scripture. There are a lot of people who would say that, who would say, if I think about God being sovereign over everything, and then I look and I see some of the horrible, awful things that go on in the world, it makes me want to hate God, you know, is what someone would say, and would say, follow up, but if I'm really being honest. How should they start to think about that?
Yeah, right. Thank you. Well, I really do think that we need to focus on Jesus in this regard. That there's so much in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, that if you concentrate on them, it just sounds like God's got a lot of power and he can use it in any way that he wants. I don't think that's the primary message of the Old Testament, but when Jesus comes along and he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, there's something wonderful about that and very revealing about that. You know, my hero in Calvinism is the great Dutch theologian who was also the prime minister of the Netherlands in the 19th century, Abraham Kuyper. And he had this proclamation that anybody who knows anything about him, this is the one thing they know, that he said, there is not one square inch of the entire creation about which Jesus Christ proclaims, this is mine. You know, that he's the Lord over every square inch of the creation. But, some Calvinists have used that in horrible ways. Like, he owns it all, and we got to go out and claim it in his name,
Mm-hmm.
and have dominion over everything, And my Civility book, I quoted Abraham Kuyper, and then I called the title of that chapter, I said, Abraham Kuyper, meet Mother Teresa.
Mm.
Because Mother Teresa was once asked, as a nun who rules over or presides over an activist order, and Mother Teresa stopped right there and said, I'm not an activist. My order is a contemplative order. She said, I had a young woman come from Paris just a couple of months ago, and she wanted to go right out and minister to lepers in the gutters of Calcutta. And I said, no, you got a lot of work to do before you can do that. I want you to go to Mass every day and hear the gospel and reflect on Jesus. I want you to contemplate the sacramental host so that you get to know Jesus so well that you can go out into the gutters of Calcutta and recognize him in his dreadful disguise among the poorest of the poor, Well, I won't go into all the theology of that, some of which I'm not sure I agree with. But what Mother Teresa was saying in her own way, there is every square inch of Calcutta belongs to Jesus Christ. Mm. And that if we want to honor him, we got to go out where he is. And I really think that a Calvinist has to hold that when we go into grieving family situations, when we go into ministering to dying people in the gutters of Calcutta, when we hear the stories of abuse of women and children, that we need that Jesus is there grieving alongside of those people, that he feels the pain of those situations. And if we're going to be good Calvinists, we've got to want to go out where he is, and we need to care about what he cares about. And it isn't just conquering inches in his name, but it's being where he is and where he wants us to be with him. Mm. And I think that means a life of compassion, a life of sacrifice, of being alongside of people. And this is why even that ridiculing person, mm-hmm. or that neo-Nazi teenager, that we have to be willing to go alongside of those people and see what's been hurting you, what have you been grieving about? Mm-hmm. I'd like to know more about who you are, because I think Jesus cares about that.
One of the problems that a lot of people, when they encounter Christianity, that they have, in addition to what we just talked about in terms of why do bad things happen in an awful world, is hell. Mm. And one unbeliever said to me one time, and the argument that he made is one that has been made ad infinitum all the way back, is to say the only difference between your God, he said, and Hitler is that at the end of the Holocaust, people were dead, and in hell, the torture and the concentration camp just goes on forever and ever and ever. A lot of people really grapple with that, and a lot of Christians grapple with the idea of hell. And one of the things that some Christians have described themselves as is a hopeful universalist. So someone would say, I think the Bible does warn about hell, teaches about hell. We need to believe it. But I hope that God's mercy extends to the degree that hell is empty. That kind of an argument. You write in Divine Generosity, and for us at CT, that you don't even want to be a universalist. And yeah. Why? Why not?
Well, one reason is that the Bible makes it clear that there will be a final judgment, and that there will be some people who will not benefit from a life of a positive, eternal relationship in the presence of God. And even though some of those passages are tough ones, they're there. Mm-hmm. More importantly, there are two issues. For me, when I think about hell and the kind of people who will probably be assigned to hell, I think of the guy who kidnaps 13-year-old girls and condemns them to a life of sexual slavery, and who lives off those profits and never has a bit of guilt about that or regret about that. And those people that took 8-year-old Jewish kids and herded them into gas chambers and just felt like they were doing their duty to their country in doing that. That is, the people that I think hell is prepared for are people who openly and consistently, persistently defy the will of God. I don't know whether that, what that means for the woman at the grocery store that I chatted with one in the checkout line yesterday. I don't know anything about that. But I do know that people who have openly defied God's purposes for humankind. Tom Wright, has argued that kind of person who consistently persecutes innocent people, who consistently abuses people, and lives off the profits of that. He says they're gradually losing their humanity. When that judgment time comes, there's not enough humanity there for us to pity or to regret, Now, we're talking about people who openly and persistently defy the will of God and their relationships with other human beings. I don't know about the rest of the human race. I just don't know. I'm as you know, I believe that, along with Charles Spurgeon and others, that in the end, far more people will be saved. And, as my Dutch Reformed aunt, who wasn't well educated, but she would say, when we're talking about the Polish Catholic neighbor that my grandmother liked so much, and my aunt would impart this bit of wisdom. Well, probably when we get to heaven, we'll be surprised who's there,
Yeah.
And I think there is a wideness in God's mercy.
But
it's a justice question too. I mean, Frank, I think, needs an opportunity on the last day to see the judgment on those who did to her and to her friends and family what was done in the Nazi era.
But let's suppose one of those persecuting guards of Anne Frank, or the sex trafficking abuser you mentioned a few minutes ago, came to faith in Christ and repented of sin. Jesus's word is still, "Come to me," right? And there would be no condemnation for them in Christ. So there would be justice in a Romans 3, the one who's just and the justifier of they who have faith in Jesus. Why would that not be enough? Justice, the cross.
Well, in one sense, it is enough. There was a memorable experience for me. We once had at Fuller Seminary, we had a dinner event with the trustees and the faculty all together. And the speaker of the evening was to be my colleague, James Bradley, Christian historian, church historian. And just before he spoke, we sang, "To God be the glory, great things he has done."
Mm-hmm.
And Jim got up and he said, I'm just having a hard time. He said, singing that hymn brought tears to me. He said, "Do you know what we just sang? The vilest offender who truly believes that moment from Jesus a pardon receives." He says, "I really want to believe that. And I really want to believe that."
Mm-hmm.
And yet, does that mean the vilest offender, that Adolf Hitler, in the moments before he died, truly believed the promises of God and pleaded for mercy? And that moment, he received a pardon for all of his sins. I have to say, on the basis of the gospel, I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I don't think that he can go into a happy eternity without facing Anne Frank.
Mm.
There's got to be something there. There's some kind of making it right in the end that goes beyond just receiving a pardon. And this is why I think our Catholic friends are onto something with that idea of purgatory.
Oh, really?
That moment from Jesus, a pardon receives. But there may need to be a time when he gets ready to live as a saint before the presence of God. I mean, some evangelical theologians have been arguing recently that well, you're either in or you're out when you die, but there still needs to be a purging that has to take place.
What does that look like? Because I know I need purging in order to live in the presence of God. I'm a sinner and I need that purging. And I think there are a lot of people who would say that, and who would say, well, what does that mean for me then when I'm at the moment of death? What do you think happens to us?
Well, I think we have in recent years been more sensitive to the fact that our final destiny is the eternal kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And that it isn't just simply passive souls basking in glory, but that there will be something like a transformation of who we are now. And that may involve a kind of learning experience. I've got to say, I don't want to get too personal about this, but I had some rough times with my mother. I loved her dearly, and she loved me. But we had some real misunderstandings, And she's with the Lord now. And I hope that when I'm with the Lord that we can sort of work on it together a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
That it won't just all be purified automatically.
Yeah. One of the things that we do here is I like to ask people, suppose you were on a desert island for the rest of your life. You can take nothing with you except for 5 books of the biblical canon.
Yeah.
And you have to choose 5 books of the Bible, and those are all you can have. What will you choose?
Oh, great. Well, you mean books of the Bible?
Books of the Bible.
Well, I would certainly want the Psalms. I think on a desert island, whatever mood I get in, and it might be bitter, there's a psalm for every occasion. And that's the wonderful thing about the Psalms. I would want to take Romans, because there's so much in it that I need to think more about and get clearer about. I got 1 F in all of my graduate studies, and it was in seminary, an epistle to the Romans course.
Oh, really?
And I had to write an exegetical paper on that "Has God forsaken his people?" passage. And it just, every time I thought I had Paul figured out, and he would say, there would be, however. and I just could not bring myself to give a firm opinion on what Paul was doing there. And I just was incapable of writing the paper, and I didn't hand it in. I got an F. But I proved myself later on by winning an exegetical prize for something else. But so I would want Romans. And I think I would certainly want the Gospel of John. I would want Genesis, just because I love Genesis. That's that creation story, and the story of the fall, and the call of Abraham, and various things in there that I just love. What am I up to? 3 or 4?
You're at 3. No, you're at 4. You're actually at 4. So one more.
The Book of Revelation. Love it. There's some wonderful passages in the Book of Revelation, and it would tell me what I'm looking forward to. In Revelation 5, you are worthy to take the book and open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you've ransomed men and women for God from every tribe and tongue and people and a nation. What a marvelous thing! that someday we'll experience what we have already, but we'll experience it in a very direct way in heaven. And that is singing the victory song of the Lamb with people from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And this has so much to do with the wonderful stuff that you've been doing about nationalism and the like, that the only nationalism that I can really get excited about is being a part of a holy nation that's scattered among the nations of the earth, of people from every tribe and tongue and nation who have belonged to Jesus Christ. And these are my fellow citizens in the kingdom. And to me, that's a solution to the mystery of so much of the nonsense that we're surrounded with today in terms of patriotism and nationalism and the like.
Suppose, along with those 5 books, you can take a song or a hymn.
Our family, my son and daughter-in-law and their 2 sons and now their daughters-in-law, we have a family hymn. Come thou fount of every blessing. And it's sung at the weddings, it's sung at the baptisms, and at funerals. And to me, that's the one I would want. And if there's another one that I'm allowed to have, it would be that wonderful hymn, the verse of which is, my sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin, not in part but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. It is well with my soul. Those 2 would do it for me.
I cannot think of a better last word for the show today, and it's an honor to talk to someone from whom I have learned so much for many, many years. Richard Mouw, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Russell. And I'm 84 years old, so we're not likely to get lost in Washington, D.C. again. But thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Host is Russell Moore. Producer, Will Dawson. Associate producers, Abby Perry and Mackenzie Hill. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.